Final Fantasy XVI was a game that I ultimately liked, but had quite a few criticisms of, with some that I've wondered if they'd address in the post-launch support. And now its brand new DLC, Echoes of the Fallen, has released, and I have finally played it. So please go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because today we are diving deep into my thoughts on Final Fantasy XVI and this brand new DLC. The premise of this story is a brand new type of crystal called dust crystals. These crystals, unlike the crystals used throughout the game, only have one charge on them. They are incredibly fragile, and when compared to crystals from the actual mother crystal, they seem incredibly inferior. As a result, you wouldn't normally see these dust crystals throughout the main game. However, as this DLC takes place at the end of Final Fantasy XVI, where Clive has pretty much destroyed all of the mother crystals, these dust crystals come into play. This leads to Clive investigating and discovering that the Fallen have made their own mother crystal, hence the lower quality of these crystals compared to the ones made by Ultima. This DLC is ultimately pretty light on story. However, what story it does have is pretty interesting, and contributes to the overall world building of Valisthea. In this DLC, you are joined by Joshua and Jill. However, one thing that I must admit is that you really don't get that much banter with them, not as much as I'd like. There are some moments here and there, but I would have liked to have heard a lot more from Jill in particular. There was a large sentiment that she didn't get enough moments in the main game, and unfortunately, you're not gonna find that here in the DLC either. This one is really tough for me because honestly, I really do like Jill, and I just want the developers to give us more of her. And again, I have hopes that the second DLC will do exactly that, but unfortunately, this first DLC really doesn't do much in that way. However, this DLC does do some things that I've wanted to see from Final Fantasy XVI for quite a long time, and that is the fact that in this DLC, there are boss fights that are actually challenging, or at least for me. Listen, I played through the game on normal mode, and that took 70 hours, and by the time I was done, I was super burnt out, playing the game for 4 to 8 hour days back to back, so I couldn't really dive straight into Final Fantasy mode. I didn't want to get so burnt out on the game, I didn't want to look at it again, so I took some time off. So indeed, I played this game on normal, and maybe it's because I've taken some time off, and this is me coming back to the game being rusty. However, some of these new bosses really put some pressure on me. I actually saw the game's game over screen, something that rarely if ever came up during the course of the main game, even during some of its toughest boss fights. It's not like these fights were super challenging or anything, but they were the appropriate level of challenge, where I had to actually pay attention to the fight, read the enemy telegraphs, and retry it a couple of times to get things down in a way I could feel satisfied. Again, that's not the most mind-blowing thing in the world for an action game. Some might even argue that it's kind of the bare minimum. I'm not here to really take a side on that, but I am here to tell you that it's a lot better than what the base game offered. I was fully engaged in these fights, and I found them really fun. They're well designed. In fact, they're more well designed than most of the fights in the base game. This DLC also doubles down on Final Fantasy XIV raid design for its boss mechanics, and yet again does so much more exceptionally than the base game does. If you're used to playing Final Fantasy XIV, these raid telegraphs will be very apparent to you, and honestly, they work really well in an action game like this, and I found myself wholeheartedly enjoying myself with these fights, not to mention the addition of new accessories. Now, these new accessories kind of blew my mind when I came across them, because some of them, in the way that they work and the kind of thinking behind their design, I was blown away that they weren't included in the base game from the start. Aside from the Berserker Ring, most of the accessories in Final Fantasy XVI just give you less cooldown time or a little bit more damage on a move, but they don't do anything that special or cool. However, apparently the DLC director, Kuji Ryoka, wasn't too satisfied with the accessories that were included in the base game, and decided to add some of his own cool accessories. And many of these accessories, again, I must say, should have just been there from the start. For example, an accessory that allows you to more visibly see the telegraph for parrying, an accessory that triggers your limit break if you die, an accessory that increases the number of times you can jump stop all the way up to 6. These accessories both add and modify mechanics in the base game. Things like the one I mentioned about extending the number of jump stops you could have would allow people to have some more in-depth customization around around their builds. And when I say it was baffling to me, it really was. My reaction to the lack of this being the base game was floored, to say the least. Why wasn't this in the f***ing base game? Dog. Why wasn't these in the base game? Okay, Ryan. Calm down. Why? But as they say, better late than never. There's also a ton of beautiful new music and arrangement added for this DLC. If you are a Final Fantasy XIV fan, you should rejoice, as you'll hear the leitmotif from Az's Law, as well as Omega's theme within 14 being remixed here. And Soken absolutely nails it yet again, reminding me why he is one of my favorite composers of all time. The DLC also adds some neat bonuses. If you're a fan of Final Fantasy VII, you'll be more than happy to know that Clive can now wield the Buster Sword. Doesn't really have the greatest stats on its own, and you will have to glam it for it to be useful. However, it is a pretty neat bonus. Now, this DLC does cost $10 and runs you about 3 hours. You can buy the Season Pass, which includes both DLCs. That is the Rising Tide, the new DLC that's going to come after this one in spring. That DLC is going to be 10 hours long. For some of you, a 3-hour DLC that is ultimately pretty light on story, though adding some really interesting lore is just not going to be worth it for you. I totally understand, but I do think that combined with the Season Pass and adding roughly 13 hours of gameplay for about $25, I do think it's a fairly good deal overall. However, I do think if you only buy this DLC as an individual for $10, it probably won't be as much worth your money. So again, if you're gonna go for it, I say go all in and get the Season Pass, because I really think that is going to be the better bang for your buck. Ultimately, this first Final Fantasy XVI DLC is promising. It was a really fun 3 hours to get reacquainted with Valistia, learn some really interesting lore, fight against Omega, and have some truly fulfilling, challenging boss fights that it felt like the original game was lacking in. Now, with all of that being said, if you like Final Fantasy XVI but you didn't necessarily love Final Fantasy XVI, I would say to hold off until the Rising Tide DLC comes out, and then getting roughly 13 hours worth of expansion to the game, allowing you to sink your teeth into something much more meatier at once. But ultimately, I like this DLC. It was short and sweet, not something that will completely change your mind on Final Fantasy XVI, but a very neat bonus for everyone who loved it. But I want to know your thoughts. Subscribe and leave a comment below letting me know what you thought of the Final Fantasy XVI DLC if you played it. Shout out to channel member Yay Pay and the rest of the Ultima community.